If someone had told me a year ago that the man in apartment 7B would become the axis on which my world tilted, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the dry, rustling sound I reserve for things that were fundamentally impossible, like spontaneous human combustion or winning the lottery. Julian, the man in 7B, was a fixed point in my universe, but he was a distant star, massive, bright, and utterly unreachable. He was a creature of noise and forward momentum. I was a connoisseur of silence and stillness. We were, in every conceivable way, occupants of different orbits. My life was a carefully curated collection of routines. The same coffee shop at 7:30, the same route to the office, the same quiet evenings with a book and the low hum of the city for a soundtrack. My apartment, 7A, was my sanctuary, a fortress of solitude built from beige walls and neatly organized shelves. It was predictable. It was safe. I had convinced myself, enough. Julian was the antithesis of my carefully constructed peace. I didn't know him, not really. I knew the sound of his heavy boots in the hallway, a rhythmic, confident tread that always made the floorboards outside my door hum. I knew the deep, rumbling murmur of his voice through the shared wall, always on the phone, the words indistinct but the tone certain. I knew the fleeting glimpses I caught of him at the mailboxes or waiting for the elevator. A wide set of shoulders in a worn leather jacket, a jawline that could cut glass, dark hair that was always a little messy, as if he'd just run his hands through it in frustration or thought. He was, from my carefully maintained distance, an intimidating landscape. A mountain range I had no desire to climb. My perception of him was built from these fragments, these sensory echoes of a life lived loudly next to my own. He was arrogance personified, I decided. The kind of man who took up space without apology, who moved through the world with an unearned certainty that I found both infuriating and, in a secret, shameful corner of my heart, deeply compelling. The distance between us wasn't just the drywall separating 7A from 7B. It was a chasm of personality, a canyon of perceived difference. He was the storm, and I was the person who always checked the weather to stay inside. Then came the Tuesday that broke everything. It started like any other Tuesday. The same coffee, the same commute, the same predictable drone of the office. But the sky had been a bruised, unsettling shade of purple all afternoon, a warning I had dutifully ignored. The rain started just after 5, not a gentle spring shower, but a furious, biblical deluge. The kind of rain that turns streets into rivers and sends people scurrying for cover like startled insects. A mandatory after-work function had kept me late, a torturous affair of forced smiles and lukewarm white wine. By the time I escaped, the city had ground to a halt. The subway was flooded. The buses were suspended. The world outside the lobby of my office building was a churning, chaotic mess of flashing emergency lights and relentless, hammering water. My phone buzzed with an alert. A citywide power outage. Transformers were blowing. The grid was down. My meticulously ordered world had been plunged into chaos. My routine was shattered, and as I stood under the relative safety of the building's awning, watching the torrential nightmare unfold, a familiar figure pushed through the revolving doors. Julian, of course. Of all the people in this sprawling metropolis, it had to be him. He stood a few feet away, shoulders hunched against a sudden gust of wind, the collar of his leather jacket turned up. He stared out at the chaos, and for the first time, I saw something other than arrogance on his face. A flicker of frustration, a hint of weariness. We were stranded, both of us. Two neighbors, perfect strangers, marooned on the same concrete island in a sea of urban collapse. The unspoken rule of our hallway, the polite nod, the averted gaze, felt absurdly flimsy in the face of this. For a long, waterlogged hour, we stood in near silence, two solitary figures pretending the other didn't exist while the city drowned around us. The air crackled with more than just the failing power lines. It was thick with the tension of our shared predicament and our practiced avoidance. Then a miracle, a single, battered yellow cab, its rooftop light a lonely beacon in the gloom, sloshed to a stop at the curb. We both saw it at the same time. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, a spark of pure animal panic. There was only one cab. We both needed to get home. He moved first, his long legs eating up the distance to the curb. My heart sank. Of course, the storm always wins. But then he stopped, his hand on the car door, and looked back at me. Actually looked. His gaze held mine, and in the flashing red and blue lights of a distant emergency vehicle, his expression was unreadable. "Where are you headed?" His voice was exactly as I'd imagined. Deeper, rougher, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the wet air. I managed to croak out our address, the name of our building. A flicker of recognition, or maybe annoyance, crossed his face. He held the door open, a silent, grudging invitation. Sharing a cab. With him, the thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me, a feeling colder than the rain soaking through my shoes. But the alternative was sleeping in the office lobby. I took a breath and plunged into the rain, sliding into the sticky vinyl of the back seat. The door slammed shut, sealing us in, and the world outside became a muffled, watery blur. We were in it together now. The routine was not just broken, it was obliterated. And in its place was this: the suffocatingly small space of a taxi, the relentless drumming of rain on the roof, and the overwhelming, solid presence of a man from 7B. The cab smelled of stale cigarette smoke and pine tree air freshener, a cloying combination that did little to mask the damp wool scent of my coat. Outside, the world was a smear of neon and shadow, fractured by the relentless rhythm of the windshield wipers. Inside, the silence was a physical entity. It had weight. It pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Julian sat beside me, a solid mass of leather and denim, his presence seeming to suck all the available oxygen out of the small space. I risked a glance. In the intermittent glow of passing headlights, his profile was stark, all sharp angles and unforgiving lines. But up close for the first time, I could see the details that distance had always obscured. There was a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, almost invisible. His dark hair was dotted with rain, clinging to his temples in small, dark curls. His hands, which I had only ever seen clenched around a phone or a set of keys, rested on his knees. They were large, capable-looking hands, the knuckles slightly calloused, the nails clean and short. He wasn't clenching them now. They were just resting, but there was a tension in them still, a stillness that felt charged. He looked tired. The thought was a surprise. I had always imagined him as a creature of inexhaustible energy, a force of nature. But the lines around his eyes were deeper than I'd thought, and there was a weariness in the set of his shoulders that his jacket couldn't quite hide. He wasn't a mountain range. He was just a tired man, stuck in a cab, in a storm just like me. This small, humanizing detail did nothing to ease my anxiety. In fact, it made it worse. The carefully constructed caricature I had built of him in my mind was beginning to crumble, and I had no idea what to replace it with. The cab hit a pothole, a jarring lurch that threw us both sideways. For a single, searing moment, the side of his thigh pressed against mine, a solid wall of heat through the fabric of our trousers. My entire nervous system went into overdrive. My skin prickled. My breath hitched. It was just an accident, a consequence of physics, but it felt like a brand. I shifted away immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs like a frantic, trapped bird. He shifted too, creating a sliver of distance between us, but the phantom warmth lingered on my skin. He cleared his throat. "Bad one," he said, his voice a low gravel. He was looking out the window, not at me. "The storm?" I asked, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "Yeah, the storm," a beat of silence. "And the potholes." It was the most pathetic excuse for a conversation, but it was something. It was a crack in the wall of silence we had so carefully maintained for months. I watched the rain trace jagged paths down the window, my mind racing. What was I supposed to say now? Ask him about his day? Compliment his jacket? The social mechanics of small talk had always eluded me, and with him, the prospect felt like trying to perform brain surgery with a butter knife. My stomach was a knot of bees. Then, another lurch, this one more violent. The cab swerved, and there was a sickening, grinding noise, followed by a rhythmic thump, thump, thump. The driver swore, a colorful stream of invective, and pulled the car over to the curb on a dark, deserted industrial street. The engine died. The drumming of the rain on the roof suddenly sounded deafening. "What is it?" Julian asked, his voice sharp with an edge I hadn't heard before. "Flat tire," the driver grumbled, not even turning around. "And I ain't got a spare. Not changing it in this mess anyway." A new kind of silence fell. Not the awkward silence of strangers, but the heavy, leaden silence of a shared, hopeless situation. We were stranded. Again, but this time it was worse. We were in the middle of nowhere in a dead car, in a city that had ceased to function. I felt a familiar wave of panic begin to rise in my throat, cold and suffocating. This was my nightmare. A total loss of control. A complete deviation from a plan. I watched Julian. He ran a hand over his face, the sound rough and scraping. He pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating his face in a ghostly blue light. No signal. Of course. He swore under his breath, a short, sharp sound of pure frustration. And then I saw it, a tremor in his hand, a slight, almost imperceptible shake. The confident, imposing man from 7B was rattled. He was looking out at the oppressive darkness, at the skeletal shapes of warehouses looming in the rain. And he looked small. He looked afraid. Something shifted inside me. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my gut, but something else rose to meet it. A strange, unfamiliar sense of calm. My dad had been a mechanic. He'd insisted I learn the basics. How to change a tire, how to check the oil, how to not be useless in a crisis. I always carried a small emergency kit in my briefcase, a powerful little flashlight, a multi-tool, things my anxiety insisted I might one day need. My overthinking, my constant preparation for the worst-case scenario, was suddenly useful. "He might not have a spare," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "But there should be a jack and a lug wrench in the trunk. And a patch kit, sometimes." Julian turned to look at me. His eyes, dark and unreadable in the gloom, seemed to be seeing me for the first time. Not as the quiet neighbor, the ghost in the hallway, but as a person. "You know how to change a tire?" he asked, a note of genuine surprise in his voice. "My dad taught me," I said, pulling the small, powerful flashlight from my briefcase. I clicked it on, a bright, clean beam cutting through the oppressive darkness of the cab. "We can at least take a look." The power dynamic, the one that had existed solely in my head for months. Him the strong, confident one, me the quiet, invisible one, had just been turned completely on its head. I was the one with the flashlight. I was the one with the plan. And as I opened the car door and stepped out into the roaring, chaotic storm, with Julian following a half step behind me, I felt a strange, unfamiliar surge of something that felt dangerously like confidence. The world was falling apart, but for the first time all night, I felt like I might just have a handle on things. The rain was a solid, cold sheet, plastering my hair to my scalp and soaking through my jacket in seconds. The flashlight beam cut a nervous, dancing circle on the wet asphalt. The driver remained stubbornly in his seat, a sullen lump in the darkness. It was just us, Julian and me, against the storm. "Pop the trunk," I called out, my voice nearly swallowed by the wind. A moment later, the trunk lid creaked open. I aimed the light inside. It was a mess of junk, but tucked away in the side compartment was a jack and a lug wrench. No spare. But there, under a greasy rag, was a tire plug kit. Hope, small and greasy, but hope nonetheless. "There's a kit," I shouted over the wind. "If we can find the hole, we might be able to patch it. Enough to get us to a service station, at least." Julian just nodded, his face grim, illuminated in the strobing beam of my light. He moved to the flat tire, crouching down to inspect it. I held the light steady for him. Water dripped from the end of his nose. His expensive leather jacket was going to be ruined. He didn't seem to care. He ran his hand over the wet rubber, his fingers probing for the source of the leak. "Here," he said, his voice tight. "Feels like a nail." What followed was a strange, frantic ballet in the rain. I held the light, my hand shaking from the cold, while Julian worked the jack with practiced efficiency, his muscles straining as he lifted the weight of the car. The initial fear I had seen in him was gone, replaced by a focused, determined energy. He was action-oriented, just as I'd always thought. But it wasn't arrogant. It was competent. It was controlled. I found myself watching his hands, the way they gripped the metal of the wrench, the sureness of their movements. He worked without complaint, the rain sluicing over him, his breath misting in the cold air. The barrier between us, the one made of silence and assumptions, was dissolving in the downpour. We were a team, a strange, unlikely team, brought together by a flat tire and a citywide blackout. "Okay," he grunted, pulling a small, vicious-looking nail from the tire with a pair of pliers from my multi-tool. Now the fun part. The patch kit was a messy, sticky affair. It required reaming the hole, which made a horrible screeching sound, and then forcing a gummy, tar-covered plug into the opening. It was a two-person job. He needed me to hold the tires steady, to aim the light just so. Our shoulders brushed, our hands knocked together as he reached for a tool. Each point of contact was a small electric shock, a jolt that had nothing to do with the storm. My mind, usually a chaotic hive of overanalysis, went quiet. There was only the task at hand, the rain, the cold, the focused beam of the flashlight, and him. After what felt like an eternity, it was done. The tire was patched, reinflated with a small, wheezing compressor the driver finally produced from under his seat, and back on the car. We were soaked to the bone, shivering, and covered in a fine layer of road grime. We collapsed back into the cab, the door squelching shut. The air inside was thick with the smell of wet clothes and ozone and something else, something that smelled like him, leather and rain and a faint, clean scent I couldn't place. He turned to me, his dark eyes searching my face in the dim light of the dashboard. I wouldn't have known what to do," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "Thanks." "It was nothing," I said, and for once, the self-deprecating words felt false. It wasn't nothing. It was something. It was a complete reversal of the roles I had assigned us. "No, it was something," he insisted, his voice quiet but intense. "You were calm, prepared." He looked down at my briefcase, then back at me. "I'm not like that. I just barrel through things. I don't think. I just react." It was the first real crack in his facade. The first glimpse of the man behind the intimidating exterior. The strong, silent type was admitting a weakness. To me, the quiet observer, the man in 7A. The rest of the ride was different. The silence returned, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was thoughtful, a shared space, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that something between us had fundamentally changed. By the time we finally reached our street, the rain had softened to a persistent drizzle. The power was still out. The entire block was plunged into an inky, unfamiliar darkness. Our building, usually a beacon of light and life, was a dark monolith against the bruised sky. The cab driver, having been paid an exorbitant amount of cash, sped off, leaving us on the curb. "Well," Julian said, looking up at the dark building, "the elevators will be out. 7 flights of stairs," I confirmed, a fresh wave of exhaustion washing over me. We walked into the lobby, the darkness inside absolute. I used my phone's flashlight, Julian using his. 2 small, lonely beams cutting through the black. The stairwell echoed with our footsteps and our ragged breathing as we began the long climb. On the 4th floor, Julian stumbled, catching himself on the handrail. "You okay?" I asked, pausing. "Yeah," he breathed. "Just long night." We finally reached the 7th floor, our legs burning, our lungs aching. The hallway, our hallway, was an alien landscape in the shifting beams of our phones. It felt more intimate, more private, in the dark. We stopped outside our respective doors, 7A and 7B. The end of the line. The end of this strange, temporary alliance. I expected him to say a quick goodnight and disappear inside. The old routine reasserting itself. But he just stood there, fumbling in his pocket for his keys. I heard the jingle of metal, then a soft curse. "Damn it, What's wrong? He shone his light on his hand. It was empty. I must have dropped them. Back there with the tire. Or in the cab. He looked at his door, then at me, and in the harsh light of my phone, I saw a raw, unguarded vulnerability on his face. He was locked out, exhausted, soaked, and locked out of his own home. The words left my mouth before I had a chance to second-guess them, before my anxiety could scream them back down my throat. You can wait in my place until the power comes back on, or you can call a locksmith in the morning. Julian looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, I thought he would refuse, that the offer was a step too far, a breach of the unspoken code of neighborly distance. My heart pounded. I had opened my door, my fortress, to the storm. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, okay. Thank you." I turned the key in my lock, the sound deafeningly loud in the silent hallway. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, into the darkness of my own home. And then I held it open for him, the man from 7B, as he crossed the threshold from his world into mine. The storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was in. My apartment, usually my sanctuary of order, felt small and overwhelmingly intimate in the dark. The beams of our phone flashlights slid over familiar objects, the neat stack of books on the coffee table, the single armchair in the corner, the clean, empty countertops in the kitchen. Seeing it through his eyes, or what I imagined were his eyes, made it all seem fragile and strange. This was my life laid bare. "I have candles," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet space. I rummaged in a kitchen drawer, my hands clumsy, and produced a few thick, unscented candles. I lit them, and the room was suddenly filled with a soft, flickering glow. The harsh beams of our phones were extinguished, and the world softened at the edges. Shadows danced on the walls, making the small space feel like a cave, a hidden shelter from the world. Julian stood in the middle of the room, looking uncertain. He seemed too large for the space, his broad shoulders filling my carefully curated world. He was still wearing his damp leather jacket, and water dripped from it onto my hardwood floor. "You should take that off," I said. "You'll catch a cold." I took it from him when he shrugged out of it, the leather surprisingly heavy and cold. I hung it over the back of a kitchen chair dry. Underneath, he wore a simple gray t-shirt that clung to his frame, revealing the powerful lines of his chest and arms. My gaze lingered for a second too long, and I quickly looked away, my face feeling hot. "Can I get you something?" I asked, retreating to the safety of the kitchen. "Water? I think I have some whiskey." "Whiskey," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the shadows. "Whiskey would be good." I poured 2 glasses, my hand still not quite steady. I handed one to him, our fingers brushing for a fleeting second. Another jolt. The air was thick with unspoken things, charged with the strangeness of the night and the unprecedented proximity. We weren't neighbors anymore. We were 2 people trapped in a candlelit room, while the city slept a forced, powerless sleep around us. He took a sip of the whiskey, his throat working. He didn't sit down. He walked over to my bookshelf, his eyes scanning the titles. I felt ridiculously exposed, as if he were reading my diary. My collection of poetry, my worn-out sci-fi paperbacks, my textbooks on architectural history. It was a map of my mind, and he was tracing its contours with his gaze. "You have a lot of books," he said, his back still to me. "I like to read," I replied, the statement sounding profoundly stupid. He turned around, his eyes finding mine across the flickering room. The amber liquid in his glass caught the candlelight. "I always thought you hated me," he said, the words blunt and unexpected. They hung in the air between us, heavy and shocking. I blinked. "What? Why would I hate you?" "I don't know," he said, shrugging, but the movement was tense. "You never look at me. In the hall, at the elevator, you always look away. I figure I'd done something to piss you off. Or you just thought I was an asshole." He took another swallow of whiskey. "I'm an asshole, sometimes." My heart was doing a painful staccato against my ribs. He thought I hated him? The irony was a physical blow. All this time, I had been constructing this narrative of his arrogance, his intimidation, his disinterest. And all the while, he had been interpreting my anxiety, my terminal shyness, as disdain. "I don't hate you," I said, the words feeling inadequate. I'm not good with people. I get nervous." The confession felt like ripping off a bandage, exposing something pale and sensitive to the air. A slow understanding dawned on his face. "Oh," he said softly. "The phone." "What?" "I'm always on my phone in the hall," he explained, looking down at the floor. "It's not because I'm some big shot doing business. It's because I don't know what else to do. If I'm looking at my phone, I don't have to try to make small talk. I don't have to see if people are looking at me." He looked up, and his eyes were filled with a startling, raw vulnerability. "It's a shield." We stared at each other. Two men, living parallel lives, separated by a single wall and a mountain of mutual misunderstanding. He wasn't the storm. He was just as afraid of the weather as I was. He had just found a different way to hide from it. My carefully constructed image of him didn't just crumble. It turned to dust and blew away in the candlelit quiet of my living room. "I live alone," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I work from home mostly. Some days, the only person I talk to is the guy who delivers my food. It gets lonely." The word, so simple, so honest, struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was my word. It was the word that defined the shape of my own life. He took a step closer. The space between us shrank. I could feel the heat coming off his body. I could smell the whiskey on his breath, mingled with the scent of rain and leather. My own breath was trapped in my lungs. My entire world had narrowed to this single, flickering moment. The city, the storm, the power outage, it all faded away. There was only the gold light, the dancing shadows, and the look in his eyes. "Leo," he said, and the sound of my name in his deep voice was something I had never known I wanted to hear. He knew my name. "Where do you know my name?" I whispered. "It's on your mail," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "I notice things. I've been noticing you for a long time." And then he closed the remaining distance between us. He moved slowly, hesitantly, as if giving me time to retreat, to put the walls back up. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, caught in the gravity of his confession, of his proximity. His hand came up, not to touch my face, but to just hover in the air near my cheek, a breath away. It was a question. I leaned into his touch, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. It was my answer. His fingers, calloused and surprisingly gentle, finally made contact, tracing the line of my jaw. A shudder went through me. It was too much. It was not enough. And then his other hand was on my waist, pulling me closer still until our bodies were aligned, chest to chest. I could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart, or maybe it was mine. I couldn't tell them apart. He lowered his head, and his lips met mine. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss. It was slow. It was questioning. It was unbelievably soft. It tasted of whiskey and rain and a loneliness so profound it mirrored my own. It was a kiss that spoke of months of silent observation, of mistaken assumptions, of a shared solitude neither of us knew the other was experiencing. In the heart of the blackout, in the shelter of my small apartment, a light had just been switched on, and I knew, with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty, that nothing would ever be the same. The morning came with a shock, not a gentle dawn, but the abrupt clinical hum of the refrigerator kicking back on. The power was back. The bedside lamp flickered to life, flooding the room with a harsh, unforgiving light. I squinted, disoriented. For a moment, I was suspended in a blissful, dreamlike state, the memory of the night a warm, heavy blanket, the feel of his skin against mine, the murmur of his voice in the dark, the impossible, staggering relief of not being alone. Then, I felt the cold space beside me in the bed. I sat up, my heart seizing in my chest. He was gone. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow next to me, the sheet was still thrown back on his side, but the man himself had vanished. A frantic, cold dread washed over me, extinguishing the warm afterglow of the night. It was a mistake. I knew it. A catastrophic, world-altering mistake. I scrambled out of bed, pulling on a t-shirt, and padded into the living room. It was empty. The candles were snuffed out. The whiskey glasses were on the coffee table, one of them still containing a small amount of amber liquid. His leather jacket was gone from the back of the chair. There was no note, no sign that he had ever been there at all, except for the faint, lingering scent of him in the air, a ghost that was already starting to fade. My mind, my old, treacherous friend, kicked in a high gear. It began to spin, weaving a narrative of regret and rejection. Of course he left. The power came back on. The spell was broken. In the clear, rational light of day, he saw what he had done. He had slept with a quiet, nervous neighbor. A moment of weakness, of storm-induced madness. A story he might one day tell his friends, a strange anecdote about the blackout. A mistake to be rectified by a swift, silent departure. I sank onto the sofa, my head in my hands. The solitude I had once cultivated as a shield now felt like a punishment. The silence of my apartment, once a comfort, was now a roaring, empty void, mocking me with a memory of the few hours it had been filled. I had let the storm in, and it had wrecked everything, leaving me more exposed, more broken than I had been before. The carefully constructed walls of my fortress hadn't just been breached, they had been leveled, and I was left shivering in the ruins. The hours that followed were a special kind of torture. Every creak in the hallway, every footstep outside my door, sent a jolt of pathetic, hopeful adrenaline through me. Maybe he would knock. Maybe he would come back to explain. But the knock never came. The silence from apartment 7B was absolute, more profound, and more damning than it had ever been before. I had to leave for work. The thought of facing the hallway, of potentially seeing him, filled me with a paralyzing dread. I felt like a raw nerve, every part of me screaming with a humiliating, vulnerable sensitivity. I took a deep breath, opened my door, and stepped out. And there he was. He was just leaving his apartment, locking the door. He was dressed for work, his hair neatly combed, his face a mask of cool indifference. The tired, vulnerable man from the night before was gone, replaced once again by the intimidating stranger from 7B. Our eyes met for a single, agonizing second. I saw a flicker of something in their dark depths. Panic? Regret? I couldn't be sure. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate, silent plea. Say something. Anything. He just gave me a tight, curt nod. The kind of nod we used to share. The nod of strangers. And then he turned and walked down the hall to the elevator without a backward glance. The invisible wall between us was back up, higher and thicker than ever before, now fortified with the memory of intimacy and the sting of rejection. I stood frozen in the hallway, the key to my apartment digging into my palm. The quiet, predictable loneliness I had known before was a dull ache. This new loneliness, the one born from a brief, incandescent connection that had been abruptly extinguished, was a sharp, stabbing pain. My former solitude had simply been an absence of company. This was the presence of an absence. It was the ghost of him in the empty space beside me, the echo of his voice in the crushing silence. The world hadn't just returned to normal. It had become a crueler, colder version of what it was before, a world where I now knew exactly what I was missing. The next 2 days were a study in misery. I moved through my routines like an automaton, my body going through the motions while my mind was stuck in a tormenting loop, replaying every moment of that night. The conversation, the kiss, the feeling of waking up alone. I analyzed every word, every touch, searching for the exact moment I had misread the situation, the point at which my pathetic hope had gotten the better of my common sense. The silence from next door was a constant, oppressive weight. The sound of his key in the lock, the tread of his boots in the hall. Sounds that were once just part of the ambient noise of my life were now sharp, painful reminders of what I had lost, or rather, what I had never really had. I avoided him, timing my entrances and exits to minimize the chance of another soul-crushing encounter in the hallway. My fortress was my prison now. I was a voluntary captive, hiding from the ghost in the next cell. On the third night, I was sitting in my armchair, a book open on my lap, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. I had been staring at the same page for 20 minutes. I couldn't focus. I couldn't think. There was just this hollow, aching space in my chest. I had resigned myself to this new reality. The brief, beautiful disruption was over. The old, lonely order had been restored. Only now it was unbearable. I would have to move. The thought came out of nowhere, stark and absolute. I couldn't live like this, separated by a few inches of drywall from a man who had held me like I was something precious and then discarded me like I was nothing. And then a knock on the door. Not a loud, confident knock. It was hesitant, soft. 3 quick, uncertain raps. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be. I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed silent, whoever it was would go away. It was probably someone with a package for the wrong apartment. Another knock, a little louder this time. More insistent. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. I walked to the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I peered through the peephole, my breath caught in my throat. It was him, Julian. He stood there, his shoulders slumped, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face was pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked the way I felt. I took a deep, shaky breath and opened the door. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with a miserable, conflicted expression. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken apologies and accusations. "Can I come in?" he finally asked, his voice rough, as if he hadn't used it in a while. I stepped aside, and he walked into my apartment for the second time. It felt different now. The air wasn't charged with discovery. It was choked with tension and hurt. He stopped in the middle of the room, in the same spot he had stood 3 nights ago, but this time he wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, the words aimed at the floor, "for just leaving. That was a shitty thing to do." "Why did you?" The question was quiet, but it felt like a scream. He finally looked up, and the raw vulnerability I'd seen in the candlelight was back, magnified by his exhaustion. "I panicked," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I woke up, and the power was on, and the sun was coming up, and it was all real. It wasn't just some weird, dreamlike thing happening in a storm. It was real, and it terrified me." He took a step closer, his hands coming out of his pockets. He gestured helplessly. "I'm not good at this, Leo. I'm not good at feelings. At people. I told you. My whole life I've just barreled through. If something gets too complicated, too intense, I run. It's what I do. So I was too intense." The hurt was a sharp, bitter taste in my mouth. "No," he said quickly, his eyes wide and earnest. "No, it was too intense. What I felt was too intense. No one has ever. I've never felt like that. So calm and so terrified at the same time. It felt important, and that's what scared me. Important things are the things you can break." We stood there, the truth of his words hanging between us. He hadn't run from me. He had run from the feeling, from the potential, from the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that this was something that mattered. The anger and hurt that had been churning inside me for days began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative understanding. He wasn't a monster. He was just as scared as I was. "I've been miserable," I confessed, the admission a quiet surrender. "These last few days have been hell. I thought it was a mistake for you, that you regretted it. It was the only thing that's felt real in years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And that's why I ran. It's the stupidest, most cowardly thing I've ever done. I spent the last 3 days pacing my apartment, calling myself an idiot, knowing I was probably wrecking the one good thing that's ever just happened to me." He closed the distance between us, his hands finding my arms, his grip gentle but firm. "I don't want to run anymore," he said, his dark eyes searching mine, pleading. "I know this is new. I know it's scary, for both of us, but I don't want to go back to the way things were. The silence. The pretending we don't live 6 feet away from each other. I can't. I could only gnaw at my throat tight." The relief was so overwhelming it felt like a physical wave, washing away the pain and anxiety of the past few days. He hadn't rejected me. We were just 2 scared people, fumbling in the dark. He reached into his pocket, and pulled something out. He pressed it into my palm. It was a key, a single, solitary key. I looked down at it, then back up at him, a question in my eyes. "It's a spare," he said, a small, hopeful smile touching his lips for the first time. "For my place. Just in case you ever want to use it. Or, in case I'm ever stupid enough to lock myself out again." The gesture was so much more than a practical solution. It was an offering, an invitation, a tangible promise that he wasn't going anywhere. It was a key to the apartment next door, but it felt like a key to everything. I closed my hand around it, the cool metal a comforting weight against my skin. It felt like an anchor. "Okay," I whispered. It was all I could manage. "Okay," he repeated, his smile widening. And then he leaned in and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation, no questioning. It was a kiss of relief, of reunion. A kiss that promised a new beginning, not in the chaos of a storm, but in the quiet, hopeful light of my living room. The weeks that followed were a gentle unfolding. The awkwardness didn't vanish overnight, but it was tempered by a shared, acknowledged desire to make it work. We were two people learning a new language, translating the silent gestures and averted gazes of our past into a vocabulary of touch and tentative conversation. The hallway was no longer a space of anxiety, but one of anticipation. A brief touch of hands as we passed, a shared smile, a quiet good morning that held the weight of the night before. My apartment and his became shared territories. The invisible line at our doorways blurred and then disappeared entirely. His worn leather jacket found a permanent home on the back of my kitchen chair. My book started appearing on his nightstand. We learned the small, domestic rhythms of each other's lives. I learned that he hummed, slightly off-key, when he made coffee. He learned that I couldn't sleep without the window cracked open, even in the cold. One Sunday morning, about a month after the blackout, I woke up to the smell of brewing coffee. I opened my eyes, and for a heart-stopping second, the old panic flared, the fear of finding the bed empty. But it was immediately soothed by the low, familiar hum coming from the kitchen. My kitchen. I smiled, stretching in the warm patch of sunlight slanting across the sheets. I found him standing at my counter, wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants that were slightly too short for him, pouring hot water into the French press. He turned as I came in, a slow, easy smile spreading across his face. The tired, guarded man I had first met was gone. The anxious, vulnerable man I had discovered in the dark was still there, but he was softer now, his edges smoothed by comfort and familiarity. He looked happy. He looked like he was home. "Morning," he said, his voice a warm, sleepy rumble. He held out a mug for me. "Morning," I replied, taking it. Our fingers brushed, a familiar, pleasant spark. The silence between us was easy now, a comfortable, shared space that didn't need to be filled. We stood side by side, sipping our coffee, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams slanting through the window. It was so simple, so domestic, and it was the most profoundly beautiful thing I had ever experienced. My old life, the one of rigid routines and carefully managed solitude, seemed like a photograph of a stranger. I had mistaken safety for happiness and quiet for peace. I had built my life like a fortress to keep the world out, never realizing that I had also locked myself in. Julian wasn't a storm that had come to destroy my world. He was the one who had handed me the key to my own prison. That citywide blackout, the chaotic event that had thrown my entire existence into disarray, had been a strange and terrifying gift. It had plunged my world into darkness, but it had forced me to finally see. To see him, the man next door, not as the arrogant stranger I had imagined, but as a lonely, frightened soul who was just as desperate for connection as I was. And in seeing him, I had finally started to see myself, not as the anxious, invisible man hiding in apartment 7A, but as someone capable of bravery, of connection, of love. He was the beautiful, unpredictable plot twist in my quiet, predictable story, the disruption that had ultimately led me to a truer, better version of my own life. I leaned my head against his shoulder, The familiar scent of him, coffee and soap and something that was just uniquely Julian, filling my senses. He wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me closer. The coffee was warm in my hands. The sun was warm on my face. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, my carefully guarded heart was warm too. It was full. It was home.